Hi, Peter Boolkah here, and welcome to today's edition of the Transition Guy. Now, joining me today in the studio is Bari and Blue, owner of Sage Events Management. Welcome to today's episode, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, delighted to be here.
Now, the reason I thought it would be good to have you on today's episode is I'm not sure what it's like fully in the US, but in the UK, it looks like we're going from pandemic to endemic, which means, and I don't want to be too premature here, but we could be entering the end game. And as you well know, the pandemic has brought so many changes. We've had lockdowns. We've had people having to shift from a physical environment to a virtual environment, which you've been doing physical sort of in-person events forever. But that was taken away during the pandemic. We've had sort of 2.5 years of virtual. My question to you today is, as we end towards the end of the pandemic, as we come towards that end game, does that mean now that virtual events are dead?
Wow, I love that question. And
it's the most popular question of 2022.
Yeah, I feel like literally every call we have, at least over the course of the last couple of weeks, are should we be doing a virtual event or an in-person event?
Or a hybrid event. Should we
event.
just, like peanut butter and jelly, they're both great. Why not just put them together?
Yeah.
So, I think it's a great question. I mean, listen, I think the interesting thing is when, basically, let's just say March of 2020 rolled around and the world started to lock down. None of us knew how long this was going to take or what it was going to be. But I really think that it's sort of like a 9/11 moment. Like the world shifted a lot, regardless of where you were in the world. That was like a massive pivot in how we looked at travel and security. It changed the way we travel and security. I think you're kind of seeing something like that here, where there's going to be a before COVID, after COVID kind of conversation, because it's that big of a shift, that big of a tilt in our world, where I don't think it's ever going back to where it was. In the beginning, it seemed like maybe a momentary change, but I think what you've had happen over the last, 2 years, let's call it, is such a big shift that it becomes the new normal, the pivot and the new normal, probably some of the most overused terms, but for a reason. Right? I mean, it literally created, for the events industry, for sure, but I think for the world at large, probably one of the biggest shifts in how we relate to each other as a family, as, families interact differently, kids learning interact differently, more people online than ever before. You've got 350 million users on Zoom every single day around the globe, right? So are virtual events dead? No, I think we've just ushered in a new normal.
Well, and I'll tell you, we've done just this year, we've done, I think, 3 or 4 actual virtual events that we've produced.
Which will end up being, it's our 84th. We're about to do our 84th
and
virtual event in 2 years.
Every single one of them was a repeat, or let's just say had an event. That same event had happened previously, also virtually, and every single one of them had attendance up, and it had revenue up, and it had general acceptance of the platform up. So are virtual events dead? We can talk about how we think about it in theory, and I don't think virtual events will ever go away, because too many people have realized that they can have a global reach, a global impact, and higher revenue from virtual events than they ever could from in-person. And they continue to be successful, right? They could, the thing that I think the reason that most people do events, it doesn't actually start with money, right? It starts with, for entrepreneurs, oftentimes it's there, but it starts with wanting to have an impact and wanting to make a difference and wanting to teach people how to do a thing. And when you realize, and when we realize, out of these last 2 years has come a global audience that didn't exist for in-person events previously. How do you ever go back, right? How do you go back to in-person and eliminate 99.99999% of your audience?
I think it's really interesting too, to use an example, we helped Tony Robbins take Unleash the Power Within, UPW, one of his most iconic events, virtual. And, this is an event that traditionally is held in stadiums where people are coming together. You've got people on the floor paying a premium, right, to be close to the stage. You've got people in nosebleed seats. The democratization of live events is that anybody could do this, and any host could do it. And for the attendees, there are no bad seats. So it was really fascinating. We were actually watching the very first UPW from the control room. And not only did we have 25,000 people on, like literally live at that time, but we started looking at every single box and we're like, oh, wow, that's 4 people. That's a classroom of people. That's a whole family watching. So now all of a sudden, an iconic event that normally you'd have to barter time with your spouse and be like, hey, I'm going to go away, or let's get someone to watch the kids. Let's go to UPW together. And we can't afford the good seats. So we're going to be able to see Tony on the Megatron and, we'll be there. Now, all of a sudden, everybody has a front row seat. Everybody's seeing him close up and he's seeing them and able to communicate with them and see their chats at the same time that he's seeing them. And you're sitting there watching going, this isn't 25,000 people. You start doing the math. This is 100,000 people. This is the biggest UPW ever. And people are all watching from their home from all over the country, all over the world.
Yeah.
I think we had 152 countries represented at that very first UPW.
Yeah.
And I think that is amazing. I suppose the question is going to be, as you said quite rightly, the Robinites who like to be close to their leader.
Yes.
I wonder what the experience was like for them, because all of a sudden that exclusivity perhaps that they had, being in front, close to the stage, I wonder if they've lost anything in that experience.
Yeah. It's interesting. This really comes down to platform, actually, and what you do. So one of the things that we do with some of our clients, and that is one of them, is you can still put those people together, because part of what they like is actually not just being close to their leader, but being close to each other, because there's a community bond as well as the educational bond. So when we do big events like that are, 10, 15, 20,000, 100,000 people, we do this inside of Zoom, which sounds crazy, but we do. Mm-hmm. And we split them up by meeting, right? So we are, what's going on technically in the background, and we could talk about technology for hours, so let's not go too far down that road. But what's technically going on is we're actually running tens and in some case hundreds of meetings simultaneously. And while everybody from their perspective has a front row seat, what we do is we put all of the people who are VIPs in one meeting, all of the people who are of a certain language, right? If you have international with you, in another meeting. So they get to communicate with their community in addition to still having a front row seat.
And go into breakouts.
Yeah. But then
I was going to ask you a question on that.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Do you find now that the interaction in those groups has grown? Because I've been
hoping you would ask that question.
No, the reason I asked that is because I've been on so many of these events, because part and parcel of what I do is I either speak at events or I attend events. And one of the things that I noticed, especially sort of in the early parts of the first year of lockdown, was the interaction within sort of conferences was dead. I mean, literally, you had to rely on a little chat box, and it was like people were just totally disengaged. Now, that may be just due to the quality of the hosting of that event and the thought behind it.
This is an interesting thing. I think if we go and forget the pandemic and forget being virtual, you would go to in-person events. And some in-person events were amazingly interactive, and like you would change your life forever, right? Like UPW is a great example, or Date with Destiny, or any other event that you have gone to where you like saw a new opportunity, you had a better interaction, the audience was like-minded. You're like, I'm so glad I took 3 days away and traveled here in order to have this experience. And then other events you go to would be completely flat, super boring. You might find yourself in the hallway. You might actually start thinking, I might skip out of here early. Is there an earlier flight to get home? So I do think that events have always had the ability to be exceptional, extraordinary, or ordinary, right? And it's no different for virtual. So I think what happens a lot with virtual, it gets lumped into a Zoom meeting, a webinar, a live stream, a live cast. And I don't think those are super engaging and interactive, and certainly not for 3 days, or even for a full day for that matter. But I do think if you are actively engaging people, you're calling out their names, you're unmuting them, you're talking to them, you're asking them questions in the chat, you're sending them into breakouts, you're having them talk with each other. What we've heard overwhelmingly from our events, and we are really into immersion and interaction, so we don't put on events that don't do that. Like it's a mandate for us. That has to be part of the event, is that people come out and say, this was actually more interactive and more immersive than an in-person event, because here's what happens. We all know this. At in-person events, there's like the cool kids, and then there's everybody else. So the cool kids who know each other are hanging out in the bar and they're sitting with each other and they're talking in the hallway. And then there's like the wallflowers on the periphery that are more introverted, or they're new, or they don't know anybody. Well, guess what? With virtual, we send you all into a breakout. All of a sudden, everybody's a cool kid. Everybody's interacting, and people that normally wouldn't talk to anybody are now meeting, 35 people over the course of 3 days or more. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. How do you overcome? Because one of the things that really worked with UPW, as an example, was it wasn't a different location, so be it a stadium or be it a concert hall or wherever, and you were taken out of your native environment, which helps shift the thinking. For many people, they're now stuck in the same environment, day in, day out, like that couch potato. I'm just wondering, do we lose some of that magic that happens when you're taken out?
I think that's a really interesting question.
You can't replicate the bar.
Well, you can't replicate the bar, but here's what's
the
interesting.
Hallway or the bar.
What we used to say with in-person events, right? Let's just talk about pre-pandemic, because I remember what I used to tell people, right? That was an answer to your question, which is when you come to an in-person event, or what we used to just call live events, when you come to an in-person event, you are a happy hostage. You are in the environment that we have created for you, right? So that you can have a different set of beliefs, so you can realize what's possible. And then as you're going through the event, you realize that I am closer to going home, back to the environment that I created that got me here, and I'm trying to get somewhere else. So I need something more, right? I don't want to go home. I love this environment that I've created. So how do I stay in this environment? And that's where, an offer comes in, a year-long coaching program, a mastermind group, something along those lines comes in,
offers.
Right? Something that keeps you in that feeling for the foreseeable future. And that's why live events, at least the way we do it, generate so much money. With virtual, you can still create that environment, right? But here's the really cool part, and what's interesting about it is they're in that environment for the time that they're with you, and then they get snapped back into their own environment. Yeah. So it's actually better in some ways, because
you had like Uber.
They have the
checking out of the hotel, getting in the Uber, checking into the plane, like into the airport.
But they have the
all those
reality
things that kind of
distortion
break
field, right? Like if we talk about what used to happen with Steve Jobs and Apple events, you have this reality distortion field, this I could get more, right? I could be more, I could do more, I could have more. That happens for these few hours, 6 to 8 hours that I'm in the live event or virtual event experience, but I'm instantly back. Like that bubble instantly breaks, and it's actually a little bit harsh, right? And it gets them wanting more, even more than in person did. So I
think
hear
the ultimate
question.
proof of that is that virtual events tend to have 90% of, if you do them properly, have 90% of the registrants show up, and then 90% of them stay over the course of 3 days till the very last session. And that's not something we ever saw with in person. Like you'd always start to see the exodus on the last day, right? As people were like, yeah, I'd love to stay, but I've got to catch the flight. I'd love to stay, but I got to get home to the wife and kids. I'd love to stay, but the only flight I could get out was, I'd love to stay, but I've got meetings tomorrow morning. Now people literally at the end of the event, boom, they're done. They stay until the very last minute. So it kind of ties back to what you're asking about interactivity and immersivity. I think if you go the extra mile to make sure that your in-person event and your virtual events are treated as live event experiences, they're focused on the experience. I actually think you're being called as a host to create an experience. People these days, we used to say in person, they vote with their phones and their feet. If they don't love it, they're on their phone or they're out in the hallway. And with virtual, they vote by just closing their computer, right? It's like lids down, I'm out.
Yeah,
so
it's as quick as this, right?
yeah,
and I'm done.
And I suppose that was the challenge I was referring to earlier.
Yes.
Was actually, I know that from sort of people doing team days and those kind of events online, a lot of people being in their natural environment, they're not necessarily as present as they would be in person.
Yeah. And I think that comes down to the pre-event setup.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that we started doing with our first virtual event that we did, which took place like April 3rd through the 5th of 2020. So like less than 3 weeks after, in the United States anyway, a lockdown was essentially declared. And we knew that was going to be a problem, right? That was the first thing that we said, how do we overcome this? And it all comes down to, you know, what a good friend of mine often says is a copy problem, right? How do you set up the attendees for success? So pre-event, we say, listen, treat this like a live event. Block it off on your calendar. We send them a box of, or an envelope, depending on how we do it, with stuff in it. And one of the things that we almost always put in it, not because they need to use it, but more as a reminder, is a little door hanger that says, shh, I'm busy, you know, making millions in here, or I'm attending a live event right now. And we say to them, listen, in the first few moments of the event, take that, put it on your door, remind people this is your time, right? These are 3 days that you would be out of the house. You wouldn't be able to have dinner with your family. You'd have to spend money on a hotel, on a plane, to Barry's point, on an Uber. All of those things would have to happen.
Your
but
cash
now,
poor before the event even starts.
Exactly.
And, you know, now you just had to get the ticket, right? I think it's interesting that, I mean, we also think about when we started with virtual, we said, what do we love the most about an in-person and how do we virtualize it? So the same way that you would never let someone walk into your in-person ballroom without credentials, without a badge and registration, we don't let that happen on our virtual events either. There's a one-to-one on Zoom registration and check-in to make sure people are ready. There are no recordings because it's not a webinar or a live stream. It's a live event, so no recordings. So they have to be present to be interacting.
Yeah.
There's gamification, so that there's constant interactivity and rewarding them for showing up, just like we used to do in in-person rooms. If you're back on time, there are door prizes. Do that same kind of thing with virtual. And, you know, we make sure that swag box arrives. I think it's super important. The same way that you'd reward attendees at in-person registration, having someone knock on your door and hand you a box is like the best reminder that it's not a live stream. It's not a webinar. Like, this is an actual event experience. Yeah. If you do those 4 things, you will have 90% show up. And then, of course, it's incumbent on you to keep it interesting, to create an incredible experience. But I think this is something. We had some in-person events last fall. And I just remember thinking all the things that at the beginning of the pandemic were like, how will we ever take the in-person magic and virtualize it? Now we were like, how will we ever take the virtual magic and make it work for in person? Like, I remember I was speaking on stage and I'm thinking, man, I miss chat. Like, you don't get thought bubbles, you know, of what everybody's thinking. You get so used to in virtual. Like, I know exactly what they're thinking, exactly what they're saying. They're interacting with me. They're telling me what they want. They're asking questions constantly. I have a barometer because I can see all their faces. And I can see their chats in a way that I can't in person. In person, I can see like maybe the first 5 rows, truly. And after that, it's a sea of heads, right? So, yeah, I think it's fascinating.
Yeah,
I've got a question on that as well, actually. Yeah. You've just a thought process. So we talk about the fact that you don't get that feedback mechanism necessarily in person. Mind you, at the beginning, when people were doing virtual events, there was no feedback mechanism, full stop.
Right.
And I think that put off people off virtual events. From what you're saying, virtual events are not going to go anywhere. We've had so much innovation in the space, it's going to continue going. But in-person events are not necessarily going to go away either.
No.
How do you blend the two successfully?
That's an awesome question. So I agree with you 100%. We are obviously very, very bullish on virtual for a number of reasons, right? You know, the global audience, more revenue, easier to accomplish. You don't have to deal with hotels and contracts and food and beverage and room blocks and all of the stuff that is the negatives to in-person events. But there are certain situations where I think in-person events are truly valuable and won't go away. You know, one are, you know, ClickFunnels is a client of ours. And, you know, we produce Funnel Hacking Live and have for the last 4 or 5 years. And that's more of a user conference, right? Where people are getting together to have a common interest in this thing that they use on a daily basis. And I think that's super valuable. The other thing that is
It's also kind of like a rock concert for entrepreneurs.
Totally.
Like, it is hard to capture the energy of what Russell and Todd and the team do at ClickFunnels virtually. And we did. I mean, interestingly, it was one of our first hybrid events. And we ended up with equal shares, virtual and in-person audiences. And even there, where there's very little interactivity with the virtual audience, people stayed until the very end because they were able to experience it. It was our internationals primarily. We're able to experience it from anywhere in the globe rather than not experience it at all. But I think what it ultimately has ushered in is the new and, not or.
Yeah.
I think everybody's looking at it as when COVID ends, do virtual events end, versus looking at it as like, wow, there's now a whole new world of in-person and virtual events. We're thinking of them both as live event experiences. They're both live events. It's just the platform's slightly different. One is in person and one is virtual. They're equally powerful and they both have their own strengths and their own weaknesses. I don't think in-person's ever going away. I don't think virtual's ever going away.
We're actually getting on a plane in about, well, what time is it? 9 o'clock?
A few hours.
In about 7-8 hours to go to Phoenix. So we're flying across the country and we are going to Phoenix for a mastermind. It's a small group mastermind that Barry and I have been a part of for the last 5 years. And we haven't gotten together in person for 2 years. And I'm actually really excited about it. But what's interesting, and Barry and I were chatting about this earlier, I'm not excited about the flight. Definitely not. I'm not excited about the actual event itself. What I'm really excited about is seeing my friends, right? So where I think virtual events, in addition to user conferences, are super powerful.
What we're not excited about is the flight, right? I think that's the key, right? I mean, I think it's that interesting thing of where you start to go, this experience I really crave in person. This one I really could do virtually. I'm going to attend that event in person. I'm going to attend that one virtually. This year I'm doing that one virtually. Next year I'm going to do that in person. I really do think we've just opened up a whole universe of opportunity. And, it's not going back. I think we will reflect on this time as when the whole event world shifted and things changed. It'd be like pre-COVID, post-COVID. Because now when you go back to in-person events, you have a whole contingency of people saying, hey, is there a virtual option? Can I watch this from home? You're like, no, it's all in person. Isn't that amazing? And they're like, I mean, it sounds good, but I would love to be able to watch it from home, because they're used to that.
So do you think going forward, there's going to be a way that we can blend it so you've got the both options, but it doesn't feel like, if you're doing a live event, in-person event, should I say, it doesn't feel like the virtual's been bolted on. Or if you're doing a virtual event, if you're doing a virtual event, the live event has been felt like a bolt on. Because that's what it felt like in the past.
It's an interest that,
Yes, it did.
Yeah. So here's
one of the biggest questions of the year is it's not will virtual events survive, it's will hybrid events survive.
Yeah.
I think that's a big one.
I think what we're going to see, we saw a lot of this in 2021, and I think we're going to see a little less of it actually in 2022 is hybrid events. So I don't think hybrid events are long for this world.
It seems like an easy thing, right? Like have your cake and eat it too. If in-person's amazing and virtual's amazing, then having both is even more amazing. But what actually happens is each one compromises the other.
And what you have to remember is when you do a hybrid event, when you do this thing where both coexist, listen, you've been an event host. Hosting an event, we'd love to say it's super easy. Whether it's virtual or in person is hard, right? You have to have stamina. You have a lot of things that you have to prepare. You've got your content. You have to interact with your audience. All of those things have to happen. When you do these hybrid events, what's going on is you're actually running two events at the same time. It's not one event where it blends nicely together. It's two events with two separate audiences who are having vastly different experiences, right? The people who
just take a simple example of the in-person audience goes to lunch together. The virtual audience doesn't. So when we do a hybrid event, we actually have virtual activities for the virtual audience while the in-person audience is eating lunch. In virtual, a lunch break might be 20 minutes. Go to your kitchen, make lunch, come back, right? In person, you have to feed people. They have to go wait in line, get a table, eat their food, pay their bill. It's 90 minutes.
Break,
yeah,
right?
bathroom break.
A bathroom break for an in-person event is 30 minutes. For a virtual event, it's 5. Like there's no lineup in my bathroom.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And that's a
Yeah,
really
so
good
you
point.
really have to think of both. Like, I think that's the key here is that the events that have been hybridized that we've run that have done the best are because we truly treated them as a virtual event and an in-person event being run concurrently. They had the same speakers, they had roughly the same agenda, but everything we did, in-person registration had a virtual registration. In-person network at your table had a virtual go into breakouts. In-person lunch break, go to the restaurant, had a virtual stick around. We're going to bring in a guest speaker. Like, you constantly have to cater to them as two different interest groups because they're having radically different experiences. The only commonality is the speakers.
And that's why I asked you that question, because it's interesting. Because as we're now shifting out from one scenario to the next, travel starting to open up around the world, what I'm seeing is many of your traditional sort of in-person events, they're all coming back now but we're also streaming it. And I'm thinking, sheesh, okay,
Well, and
which
that
is
was
it going to
a
be?
crap experience pre-pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember live streams of events?
How many years we did that? Like, I
Right.
think there was a good 5-year run in our 20-year history that we live streamed because it was like, this is be amazing. Like, you're doing an in-person event, why not? But what happened was lower viewership, fewer people showed up,
And
fewer
way
people
lower
stuck
conversions.
around.
Oof.
And if you're in the world of conversions, way lower conversions.
Well,
Like, converted a fraction of even a webinar.
We've done that on a couple of sort of in-person events where at the time we streamed in the actual speaker. So one of them was we had Jim Collins as a speaker. Now, Jim Collins in person is phenomenal, absolute master. But with technology being what it was, especially at the hotel end, and American hotels are traditionally bad for internet.
Well,
Beam it
America
in.
in general is traditionally bad for internet.
But you sort of bring it in. The Jim Collins experience was awful.
Yeah. Yeah, it is fascinating to watch. I think during the last 2 years, you've had speakers who have created their own home studios and really rocked out, creating an incredible virtual experience, either by traveling to the virtual stage or doing it from their home studio.
Yeah.
And you've had other speakers who've died on the vine because they're not willing to really embrace what is the experience. You do have to show up differently. You have to teach differently. You have to engage differently.
Well, if you've done it right, you should also have a set that gives you as the speaker some visibility. Like, hey, Chuck, can we show the over-the-shoulder camera just for a second? For those of you who are watching on video, like Barry and I are sitting in front of a camera, but right behind the camera are 4 TVs. Now, right now, it's just Peter and Barry and I, but when we're talking to a big audience, we see 200 faces in front of us and we can interact.
Yeah.
Right.
And chat.
And doing that makes a big difference as a speaker. And most speakers don't have that
I have
setup.
to tell you, that's an interesting thing. When we first went from in-person to virtual, forced by COVID, and we had 2 weeks literally to pivot and make that decision. We had, I think the country shut down March 15th for us Americans, and we had an event the first week of April.
Yep.
And we went to a client who'd done events that traditionally had been 300 Americans coming together, fairly small, intimate event, always an American audience. So let's just try this. He ended up having 1,200. And for the first time ever, a global audience. He'd never had a global audience. He grossed more and he netted more. So for us entrepreneurs, that's important. What we net's more important than what we gross, a lot less expensive. But one of the things that I think was a hallmark for us and has really shifted how we look at virtual events, and it's why we've been able to generate, we're at, I think, over $400 million in revenues from events in the last 2 years through virtual, is we always focused on the host experience before the attendee experience. I think so many people out there are so worried about the attendees, but if the host isn't feeling it, the attendees aren't going to feel it. So from the very beginning, it was like, what's the host ability to see the audience? What's the host ability to unmute and hear the audience? What's the host ability to see the chat? And if you're just looking at it as kind of, I'll show up, I'll sit down in front of a camera versus how do I make it immersive for me as the speaker? To your point, not every speaker's done that. Like, just because you're speaking from home doesn't mean you should be sitting in a chair. Like, right?
Absolutely,
Like, you have to
right.
really be thinking about how do you create your best possible experience with light, with sound, with walking, with talking, with interacting. Not everybody's done that. And I think it's kind of separated the men from the boys a little bit, if you will, right? I mean, it's created some real differences in who's succeeding on stage. Some new rock stars have been born in the last 2 years, and some people that have been traditional go-tos have not really translated as well in virtual.
No, I agree with that. And actually, they're not. A lot of people just haven't invested in professional studio equipment.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
one of the
what's
things.
I mean, even for us, we're in our podcast studio, but if we were presenting to a virtual audience, we'd be in our main studio where we have, 4 times the number of TVs. We have 2 remote cameras who are tracking with us. They're 2 behind that are giving us multiple views. We've got 2 separate chat boxes. I mean, it's like truly a production studio, and it needs to be if you're going to create a really amazing experience as a speaker.
Yeah.
And maybe that's going to be the transition for people who's actually moving away from a home working solution to a proper professional solution.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting, if we just talk about this, the room that we're in right now, I mean, I'm looking at 4 55-inch televisions that I bought at Walmart for $350 a piece. Like, we're not talking about super high-end professional. Now, admittedly, I have a nice microphone in front of me,
It's
right?
good lighting.
But more because it's pretty, not necessarily because I need it. I've got a camera in front of me, but that camera is
Why
camera
is
was
it the
under $1,000.
democratization of live events? Like, we've been calling COVID the democratization of live events for this very reason.
Well, because in reality, if you can get some decent lighting, because, we talked a little bit about this beforehand, good sound and good lighting are both pretty important. If you can nail those 2 things, and it doesn't take a tremendous amount of money to do that, and then you can set yourself up. You don't need 4 like we have. You just need 1 decent sized television, and make sure that, in my mind, it's right behind the camera. So as you're talking into the camera, you can also see your audience. Yeah. Now, all of a sudden, you've up-leveled your own experience and you've up-leveled their experience. And if you can do those 2 things, you don't need to spend as much money as probably you or I have, or we have, on the studios that we've got in place. You can do it oftentimes with things you already have. But it does, if you put a little bit of effort into it, it goes a long way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for the first time, you don't have to go out and get a hotel, take on the liability of a contract, a food and beverage minimum, room rental, room blocks, that kind of thing, which have kept hosts from having events forever. It's like, I'm just nervous to take on that liability. Yeah. Now you can go out there and beta test an idea, in a moment's notice, as long as you have a computer, a TV, a couple floor lamps with no shades on them. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to spend a fortune to do it. Yeah. So we've been saying, whether you want to have an event for 550, 500, 5,000 or more, you can do that through the power of virtual, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. That is a massive shift.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm judging by our conversation that basically virtual events are not dead. They're only getting started.
I think they're only
I think we're only seeing the beginning. Yeah. I think you're right. And I think the more people do them well, the more people continue to push the envelope, the better they'll continue to be. I think, oddly enough, I think Tony Robbins did us all a massive favor by, putting millions of dollars into a studio and giving people a pretty amazing virtual experience, because it starts to make people think, I wonder if I could do that. And if they're thinking it, it's probably possible. He may have spent millions of dollars, but you don't need to.
Yeah. To create a truly.
But you do need to invest in the right equipment.
I think that is key. I mean, if it were me and I were committed, if I were an author, a speaker, a course creator, an influencer, if I wanted to be able to reach people around the country or even around the globe, I would be putting some basic investments into having a really great home studio or office studio that allowed me on a moment's notice to drop in to any event anywhere in the world and create a truly interactive, immersive experience for the attendees.
And the one thing I would say is, given that we are very much in a digital world now, every single entrepreneur out there is a content creator of some form. So
and
you
so
might
are their children.
Yeah,
like, what's
absolutely.
fascinating, the world that's coming up behind them They don't even, kids these days don't even watch TV. They go directly to digital, right? It's like the TV is antiquated, right? It's like, I'm going to go direct to digital to live current content. So I think there's what's happened in the world for all of us forced by the pandemic. And then I think there's a whole generation of people behind us. They're like, virtual's where it's at. They're so used to that. That is the norm.
I think the scary bit is when the kids are better than the parents at the content creation,
For
which
sure.
is often the case.
Yeah, we often say you don't need an AV tech. If you have a teenager in your house, you probably have everything you need to,
It's true. Absolutely
to get everything
true.
wired and ready to go.
So if people want to know more about you, they're interested in what you've spoken about today, where do they go?
I think the best thing, if you're interested in virtual events, is to actually attend one. And we do a virtual event a couple times a year. Our next one is taking place at the end of March 2022, and then another one is taking place in end of September of 2022. You can go to tve.live. The event, we're not great marketers, so the event is called The Virtual Event on Virtual Events.
Super creative.
And TVE stands for The Virtual Event. So tve.live, it's less than $100 to join us for 3 days and go deep on all of this stuff. We'd love to have you there, to interact, and to have you see what is possible with a virtual event, because as you can imagine, because we produce them, because we teach them, we also do a pretty decent job of our own. Our owns. We do a pretty good job of our owns there. Anyway, so we'd love to have you. That's where you can find out a little bit more about us.
No, and I think that is crucial. Thank you for sharing that, because at the end of the day, I think the audience is in two camps right now, because as you said, there are events out there now that are truly world class, leading the way, and people are loving them. And then there are people that are still doing such a shitty job at it.
Yeah. And that's really like, we've been looking at this as and I felt this way about in-person events too, by the way. So it's how do you create amazing event experiences that change lives? Because I really believe we change the world one live event, one attendee at a time. There's nothing like a live event to transform how you think about yourself, your business, and the world. And that's what we're committed and passionate about doing. We call them purpose-driven paydays for a reason, to expand your impact and your income. So, if you are on a big mission and you want to get the message out there and you want to reach more people, very few things will do that like a live event. And now you have the power of doing it from your living room, which is pretty amazing.
So there we are. It's a learning curve for us all. It's not going away, and we just need to get better at it. Now, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, share it with others so that they can also benefit and like it. If anything has resonated with you today and you want a bit more information, head over to Boolkah.com and get in touch. Listen, Barry and Blue, thank you very much for being such amazing guests. It's been a fascinating topic, probably a lot longer episode than would normally happen, but then this has been quite an immersive topic. Virtually.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
Seriously, we so appreciate you. It's been great spending time with you and your audience.
For sure. And, I think that's what happens when you put two people who talk too much on the same podcast together. So, it's been a pleasure.
If only we could send you into a breakout right now, we would.
Yeah, that would be the icing on the cake. No, it's been amazing. And thank you for being such great guests. And remember, everyone, failing to learn is learning to fail. And in this case, get better at life events. Please stay safe, and thank you very much.